The cold weight of the silver badge pressed against my eye level was the first thing I saw when I swung open my front door, followed closely by the jagged, triumphant smirk of my sister-in-law, Elena. She wasn't wearing her usual cheap polyester suits. She was clad in a tactical vest with Federal Agent emblazoned across the chest in blinding white letters, flanked by two men who looked like they'd been carved out of granite. "Identification and residency paper, Sarah. Now," she barked, her voice carrying across the quiet cul-de-sac where my neighbors were already peering through their blinds. She didn't just want to see my documents. She wanted to see me in handcuffs on my own lawn. A final act of vengeance for a decade of perceived slights she had nursed like a poisonous pet. What she had forgotten in her rush to destroy my life was that the man she claimed she was protecting from my supposed green card scheme, my husband Mark, wasn't just an officer of the law. He was a lieutenant who had spent the last 6 months investigating the very corruption she had just walked into our driveway to perform. Our life before that Tuesday afternoon had been the kind of quiet, rhythmic existence that people usually take for granted. We lived in a restored 1920s craftsman house, with a wraparound porch that smelled like linseed oil and the lavender bushes I'd planted beneath the windows. Mark and I had been married for 12 years, a decade of which had been spent navigating the subtle, icy waters of his family's disapproval. I was the outsider, the woman with the slight accent and the grandmother's estate that Elena felt belonged to a real member of the family. Mark was my rock, a tall, observant man with eyes that seemed to catch every flicker of movement, a trait that had served him well as he climbed the ranks of the police department. He was the kind of man who brewed a fresh pot of coffee every morning before I woke up and left a single wildflower from the garden on the kitchen island next to my car keys. Elena, however, was the grit in the gears of our happiness. She had bounced from one administrative job to another, always blaming the system or the immigrants for her lack of progress, until she miraculously landed a position with a federal enforcement agency. At first, it was just small comments at Sunday dinners, snide remarks about vetting and security clearances directed at my side of the table. She began wearing her work lanyard everywhere, even to her nephew's birthday party, tapping the plastic casing as if it were a scepter of absolute power. My husband would always squeeze my hand under the table, a silent signal to let it go, to ignore the biting wind of her jealousy. We didn't realize that her resentment wasn't just a personality flaw, it was a blueprint for a coup. The house was our sanctuary, but to Elena, it was the prize. It was the asset she felt I had stolen by marrying her brother. Every time she visited, I caught her running her fingers over the mahogany banisters, or staring at the deed-holding safe in the study with a look of predatory longing. She saw my legal status, which had been settled years ago through a grueling, expensive process, as a vulnerability she could exploit if she just leaned hard enough on the right levers. She started asking strange questions about our finances, about where the original copies of my naturalization papers were kept, couching it in family concern for Mark's career. "A man in his position can't afford any shadows in his closet, Sarah," she'd say, her eyes darting around our living room as if looking for a loose thread to pull. Mark had become increasingly quiet over the last few weeks. He was working late, his brow furrowed over files he wouldn't let me see, his phone buzzing at odd hours. I assumed it was just the stress of the promotion board or a difficult case. I didn't see the connection between his late nights and the way Elena had stopped coming over for coffee. I didn't notice that the treaks in our domestic peace were actually fissures. I was too busy enjoying the warmth of our home, the smell of the rain hitting the hot pavement of our driveway, and the feeling of security I thought I had finally earned. Then came that Tuesday. The air was thick and humid, the kind of afternoon where the world feels like it's holding its breath before a storm. I was in the kitchen, the radio playing a soft jazz tune, preparing a marinade for the steak Mark had requested for dinner. I heard the heavy thud of boots on the porch, too heavy for the mailman, too synchronized for a neighbor. When I opened the door, the transition from peace to terror was instantaneous. There stood Elena, her face a mask of bureaucratic cruelty, flanked by her team. She didn't look like a sister-in-law. She looked like an executioner. The sun caught the edge of her handcuffs, and for a moment, the world tilted on its axis. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, and the smell of the lavender outside suddenly felt cloying, like flowers at a funeral. She stepped across the threshold without an invitation, her boots muddying the rug I had spent hours cleaning, and held up a manila folder with my name printed on it in bold, black ink. "The game is over, Sarah," she whispered, her breath smelling of stale coffee and malice. "I am taking back what belongs to this family." The cracks in the foundation of my life didn't appear all at once. They spiderwebbed slowly, almost invisibly, over the month leading up to that afternoon on the porch. It started with a Sunday brunch at my mother-in-law Martha's house. The air was thick with the smell of overcooked bacon and the suffocating scent of Martha's floral perfume. Elena had been unusually quiet, her eyes darting between me and the mahogany sideboard as if she were mentally cataloging the silver. "You know, Sarah," Martha said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet concern that always made my skin crawl. "Elena's been doing so well at the agency. She has access to, well, everything now. She was saying how easy it is for mistakes to happen with those old residency files. People just disappear into the system if their paperwork isn't perfect." I laughed it off then, a nervous flutter in my chest. "Mine is more than perfect, Martha. Mark and I checked it a dozen times." I looked to my husband for support, but for the first time in 12 years he didn't meet my gaze. He was intently focused on buttering a piece of toast, his movements mechanical and stiff. "Mark?" I prodded. He finally looked up, but his eyes were clouded, distant. "The law is the law, Sarah," he said, his voice flat. "If there's a discrepancy, it has to be handled. Elena is just looking out for the family." The word family felt like a cold stone dropped into a still pond. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Over the next 2 weeks, the "looking out for the family" excuse became a recurring theme. Elena started dropping by our house unannounced, always when Mark was at the precinct. She would ask to use our printer or accidentally leave her phone in the study, forcing her to linger near the filing cabinet where we kept our most important documents. One evening, I walked into the kitchen to find her standing by the junk drawer, holding my passport. Her thumb was grazing the gold-leafed emblem on the cover, a look of pure, unadulterated envy on her face. "It's a beautiful document," she'd whispered, not even startled that I'd caught her. "A lot of people would kill for the security this represents. It's a shame when someone doesn't deserve it." The real alarm bells began to ring when I noticed Mark's behavior shifting from distant to outright suspicious. He began taking calls in the garage, his voice hushed and urgent. When I'd walk in, he'd snap the phone shut and start talking about a big case he was working on, something involving internal affairs and high-level corruption. He looked haggard, dark circles bruising the skin under his eyes, but he refused to let me in. "The less you know, the better, Sarah. Just trust me," he told me one night, his hands trembling slightly as he poured a glass of bourbon. I wanted to trust him, but the silence between us was becoming a physical presence, a third person living in our house. The point of no return arrived 48 hours before the raid. I was looking for a spare set of keys in Mark's home office when I knocked over a heavy leather portfolio he'd brought home from the station. A sheaf of papers slid across the hardwood floor. As I knelt to gather them, a word in bold red ink caught my eye. "Deportation proceedings. Summary review." My breath hitched. I pulled the document closer, my heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. It wasn't a police report. It was an internal ICE dossier, authored by Elena, and it was filled with lies. It claimed my marriage to Mark was a sham, a financial arrangement designed to bypass federal law. But the true horror lay on the final page. There was an affidavit of support withdrawal form. It was a document that, if signed by a spouse, would effectively strip an immigrant of their legal protection. And there, at the bottom, was Mark's signature. The world didn't just go quiet, it became a vacuum. I felt a sudden, violent surge of nausea that forced me to sit back on my heels. The room began to spin, the edges of my vision blurring into a gray haze. My hands were shaking so violently that the papers rattled like dry leaves. I looked at the signature again, the familiar swoop of the M, the way he always crossed the K with a slight upward flick. It was his. My husband, the man who had promised to protect me, the man I had built a life with, had signed a document that labeled me a criminal. A cold, piercing sweat broke out across my forehead, and for a moment I couldn't remember how to breathe. It felt as though the floor had vanished, leaving me suspended over a bottomless abyss. The smells of our home, the linseed oil, the faint scent of my perfume, suddenly felt like a mockery. This wasn't a sanctuary, it was a trap. I realized then that Elena wasn't just acting out of spite. She was executing a plan that required Mark's cooperation, or his silence. I heard the garage door groan open. Mark was home. I scrambled to put the papers back, my movements clumsy and panicked. I managed to shove the portfolio back onto the shelf just as his footsteps sounded in the hallway. When he entered the room, he saw me standing there, pale and trembling. "Sarah, you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with a concern that now felt like a serrated blade. "I'm fine," I managed to choke out, my throat feeling as though it were lined with glass. "Just a headache. The heat, I think." He stepped toward me, reaching out to touch my shoulder, and I had to fight the instinctive urge to recoil. His hand felt like ice through my shirt. I looked into his eyes, searching for the man I knew, but all I saw was a stranger wearing my husband's face. In that moment, the quiet life ended. I didn't know yet why he had done it, or what Elena had promised him, but I knew that the man standing in front of me was no longer my partner. He was my warden. And as I watched him walk away to change out of his uniform, I realized I had exactly 2 days to find a way to survive before the trap snapped shut. "Sit down, Sarah," Elena commanded, her voice ringing with a terrifying, cold authority. She didn't wait for me to comply. She shoved a stack of papers onto our polished dining table, right over the lace runner my mother had sent me from home. "We can do this the easy way, where you walk out of here in your own shoes, or we can do this the hard way, where my colleagues back there carry you out in restraints." I looked at the 2 men standing by my front door. They were impassive, their hands resting near their utility belts, their eyes scanning my living room as if it were a crime scene. The smell of the rain from outside mingled with the metallic scent of their gear, creating a suffocating atmosphere that made it hard to draw a full breath. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. "On what grounds?" I whispered, my voice sounding thin and alien to my own ears. "I'm a citizen, Elena. You know that. You were at the ceremony." Elena let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh that had no humor in it. "A ceremony based on a lie is a nullity, Sarah. We've been reviewing the evidence you provided for your initial residency. It's amazing what a little deep dive into your family's history back home can uncover. Discrepancies in birth records, undeclared distant relatives with, shall we say, colorful political backgrounds. You lied on your application. That makes your citizenship fraudulent, and fraud makes you an illegal alien." I felt the blood drain from my face so quickly I thought I might faint. The room seemed to tilt, the familiar furniture, the bookshelf we'd assembled together, the armchair where I read every Sunday, suddenly looking like props on a stage that was being dismantled. "That's a lie," I breathed. "You're making this up because you want this house, because you've always hated that Mark chose me." "Hated you?" Elena stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "No, Sarah, I don't hate you. I pity you. You thought you could come here, marry into a respectable family, and steal a piece of the American dream that my brother worked his life for. You're a parasite. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a hiss. And the best part? The host has finally realized he's being fed upon. At that moment, I heard the heavy click of boots on the hardwood floor behind me. I turned, my heart leaping with a desperate, dying hope. Mark was standing in the doorway leading to the kitchen. He was still in his lieutenant's uniform, his brass pins glinting under the recessed lighting. But he wasn't rushing to my side. He wasn't drawing his weapon to defend his home. He stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of stone. "Mark," I sobbed, reaching out a hand toward him. "Mark, tell them. Tell her she's wrong. You have the papers in the safe. You know everything is legal." Mark didn't move. He didn't even look at my hand. His gaze was fixed on a point somewhere above my head. "The safe is empty, Sarah," he said. His voice was low, devoid of the warmth that had been my anchor for 12 years. "Elena found some very troubling things. I couldn't ignore them. Not in my position." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. I staggered back, hitting the edge of the table. You gave her the documents?"
You gave her the codes? I did what I had to do for the family, he said. And the way he used that word, the same way his mother had used it at brunch, felt like a death sentence. "For the family?" I screamed, the shock finally giving way to a raw, bleeding agony. "I am your wife. We've been together for 12 years. How can you stand there and let her do this? Talk to me, Mark. Look at me." Mark finally dropped his gaze to mine, but there was nothing there. No love, no regret, just a chilling, bureaucratic indifference. "There's nothing to talk about right now, Sarah. You should just cooperate. We'll talk later, when this is settled." "Later?" I echoed, the word tasting like ash. "She's trying to deport me. There is no later." Elena stepped back into my line of sight, a smug, triumphant grin pulling at her lips. "He's right, Sarah. Cooperation is your only friend now. See this?" She held up a document with a bright red header. "This is a voluntary departure form. If you sign it now, we don't have to go through the unpleasantness of a detention center. You can leave with some dignity. We've already taken the liberty of freezing the joint accounts, standard procedure in fraud cases, you understand. So don't bother trying to call a high-priced lawyer. You don't have the funds." "You froze my money?" I gasped. "That's my inheritance, my grandmother's money." "It's tainted assets now," Elena corrected, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "And since the house was purchased with some of those assets, it's being placed under a temporary seizure lien. Mark will stay here as the custodian of the property, of course, to ensure it doesn't fall into disrepair while the government processes the forfeiture." The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a sickening crunch. It wasn't just about getting rid of me. It was a coordinated heist. They wanted the house, the inheritance, and the clean break, all wrapped up in the flag of federal duty. They had waited until Mark was a lieutenant, until his word carried enough weight to squash any local interference, and until Elena had enough rank to pull the strings at her agency. "You're both monsters," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of terror and a new, flickering spark of rage. Elena didn't blink. She just tapped her watch. "You have 5 minutes to sign, Sarah, or the handcuffs come out, and I'll make sure the neighbors get a very long, very detailed look at the criminal they've been living next to. What's it going to be? The pen or the steel?" I looked at Mark one last time, pleading with my eyes for some sign of the man I loved. He simply turned his back on me and walked toward the window, staring out at the street as if I were already gone. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a clock that, according to Elena, I no longer had the right to own. My world had ended, and the man who was supposed to be my world was the one who had pulled the trigger. The pressure in the room was physical, a heavy, suffocating weight that made the very air feel thick with malice. Elena held the pen out to me like a dagger, her eyes dancing with the reflected light of my own ruin. I looked at the pen, then at the voluntary departure form, and then at Mark's broad, unmoving back. My heart, which had been hammering like a trapped bird, suddenly stopped its frantic rhythm. A strange, glacial calm washed over me. It was the click, that moment where terror reaches its limit and turns into a cold, hard clarity. I remembered something then. I remembered the document I had seen in Mark's portfolio 2 days ago. I had been so blinded by the word deportation that I hadn't processed the header on the second page. Authorized Undercover Operation, Internal Affairs Division, OIG Joint Task Force. I didn't take the pen. Instead, I leaned back against the table, crossing my arms. The trembling in my hands had stopped. "You're in an awful hurry, Elena," I said, my voice sounding strangely resonant in the quiet room. "For a federal agent conducting a legitimate seizure, you seem very concerned about me signing this voluntary form before any actual processing happens at a field office. Where's the transport van? Where's the rest of the team? It's just you and 2 guys who look like they're on your personal payroll." Elena's smirk flickered. "Don't be a fool, Sarah. You're in no position to negotiate. Sign the paper or the handcuffs go on. Now." I looked past her to Mark. "Mark, honey, you can stop staring at the street now. I think she's said enough." For the first time since they had entered, Mark turned around. The stone mask he had been wearing didn't just crack, it vanished, replaced by a look of such lethal, concentrated focus that Elena actually took a step back. He didn't look at me with pity. He looked at his sister with a grim, professional detachment.
"You always were too greedy for your own good, Elena," Mark said. His voice was low, vibrating with a power I'd never heard him use at home. "You thought you could use my promotion to shield your side hustle. You thought because I was a lieutenant, I'd be too worried about my own career to notice that you were shaking down immigrants for their property and selling them their freedom." Elena's face went from triumphant to a sickly, mottled gray. "What are you talking about? I'm doing this for you, for the house, for the family." "The family?" Mark stepped into the center of the room. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black device, a remote. He clicked it once. In the corner of the ceiling, hidden behind the crown molding I had painted just last spring, a tiny green light began to pulse. The FBI's Office of Inspector General has been looking for the person inside ICE who was feeding dead-end residency files to a private real estate group. They just couldn't find the link, so I gave them one. I gave them you. The 2 agents by the door suddenly shifted. They didn't reach for their handcuffs, they reached for their radios. "Target is contained, bring them in," one of them said. They weren't Elena's team. They were the OIG agents Mark had been working with for months. Elena's scream was a high, jagged sound that tore through the house. "You set me up. You signed the affidavit. I saw it." "I signed a piece of paper that was logged and serial numbered as evidence 3 months ago, Elena," Mark said, walking over to me and finally taking my hand. His grip was warm and solid, the anchor I had thought was lost. "Every conversation you've had in this house for the last 4 weeks has been recorded. Every time you touched that safe, every time you threatened my wife, it's all on a federal server now." The front door burst open, and this time it was the real authorities. Real tactical gear, real warrants, and a swarm of blue windbreakers that flooded our living room. Elena was pinned against the dining table, the same table where she had tried to sign away my life. As they ratcheted the handcuffs onto her wrists, I leaned in close to her ear. "The American dream is a beautiful thing, Elena," I whispered, my voice cold enough to frost the air. "It's a shame you're going to have to watch the rest of ours from behind a plexiglass window." The fallout was spectacular. Elena didn't just lose her job,
She was hit with a litany of federal charges, from extortion and wire fraud to civil rights violations. Her partners in the real estate group turned on her within 48 hours, trading her head for their own leniency. My mother-in-law Martha tried to call and beg for family mercy, but Mark told her that the family she cared so much about was currently being represented by a public defender, and he hung up the phone. He didn't just win the case. He won a commendation that solidified his place in the department for the rest of his career. 12 months have passed since that humid Tuesday. The lavender bushes have grown taller, their scent a constant, soothing presence on our porch. I'm sitting on the wraparound porch now, watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the lawn where Elena once stood. Mark is inside, the familiar, comforting sound of the coffee maker humming in the kitchen. We don't talk about that day much anymore. We don't have to. The house is ours, truly ours, free of the shadows and the secrets that once lurked in the corners. I look at the garden, at the life we've defended and rebuilt, and I realize that the quiet life isn't something that's given to you. It's something you fight for. A betrayal can burn your world to the ground, but if you're brave enough to sift through the ashes, you'll find that the truth is the only thing the fire can't touch. And sometimes, the person you thought was letting you fall is actually the one building the net to catch you.